Let me go to share. And do you see the slides?
Yes.
All right.
So, Riley?
What was that? Hopefully you had a chance to look over the slides over the last week and watch the short video about Reconstruction. I just want to go over a few things and we'll wrap up Reconstruction today. We'll be ready to tackle chapter 16 on Monday as we look at different aspects of American life, that some of it coincided with Reconstruction, but basically we're going to look at the three final decades of the 1800s, and we're going to look at the aspect of the growth of big business, tycoons who were wealthy, and we're going to see how that affected the working class labor in America. We will also look at, and this is chapter 16 through 18, we will look at the continued conflict with Native Americans between the U.S. government and the native tribes, which we are at a period that we're looking at that the Native Americans of Florida and Southeast have already been removed to Oklahoma. So we're going to look at the final phases of the Indian Wars in the 1870s. We'll also look at westward expansion as Americans continue to move westward, and that is one of the reasons why there were still clashes between Americans and Native Americans, or European Americans and Native Americans. And let me see, we'll look at the the Native American conflicts with the American government, the rise of big business, and the labor issue. And then we will also start to look into the nation's expansion, the United States' desire and goal to build an empire. And so adding new territories. So that's what's coming up the next couple of weeks before the test. I do need to announce that the first quiz is scheduled for tomorrow through Saturday. But since we, the first time we met, we just kind of went over the syllabus, and then we had this past Monday off. I'm going to delay that until Friday. And so I will make the quiz available tomorrow night at 10 p.m. It'll be open book, and you'll have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to complete it. And I did not figure that anybody would have a problem with that. Reconstruction. Both Lincoln and then after he was assassinated, Johnson, his vice president, who became president, both of these two presidents, number 16 and 17, they had a somewhat lenient plan to bring the South back in. Lincoln especially wanted to make it a smooth and somewhat easy act of reconstruction so that the South could be brought back into the Union fairly quickly and healing would begin. You need to be aware of, and if I went over this already last week, let me know so I don't do it again. His plan was called the 10% plan. If one of the southern states, for example, Alabama, whenever 10% of the population of Alabama basically took an oath to be loyal to the United States, and then that 10% also agreed that slavery would be illegal, once they made that pledge, they could then form a new government. There were a couple of restrictions. The government leaders of Alabama during the Confederacy, as well as the top military leaders, could not be a part of that 10%. So the political and military leaders of the Confederate governments were excluded from the forming of new governments in the South. You can see there that Louisiana quickly took advantage of President Lincoln's plan. Now, it's important for you to understand, if you don't already, many people are under the idea that we elect a new president and things will change, but that's not how our government works. And even though we have 3 separate branches of government that all have equal power and they can keep checks and balances on each other, the way that our founders set up the 3 branches is that really Congress would have more, not power, but Congress would be able to have more influence than the other 2 branches when it comes to making new, well, of course, they're the lawmaking branch. The president is simply supposed to enforce the laws. But there's always been a back and forth, not always, starting probably with Andrew Jackson, a back and forth between the president and Congress. So this was no different with Reconstruction. The Congress felt like they should control how the South comes back into the Union. And they felt like Lincoln's plan was just too lenient. So 2 senators, Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis, came up with a plan that was an alternative called the Wade-Davis Bill. And a state could come back in if they met 2 conditions. They had to completely ban slavery. Didn't matter if only 10% of the state said so. It had to be a complete ban. And then a majority of the adult males. So instead of 10%, 50% at least. That would be a majority. 50% of adult males, or I guess 51%, had to take that oath. So it was a little bit firmer than Lincoln's plan. I like this little provision here. Only Southerners who would swear that they never supported the Confederacy could vote or hold office. So that seems kind of silly. How could you know if someone was telling the truth or not? Oh, I never supported the Confederacy, but it was a little stricter. Lincoln would not sign this bill because he thought, naturally, that fewer states would agree to it. He felt like his plan was just better and would help restore order a lot swifter. What would a second presidency of Abraham Lincoln look like? Well, we didn't get to see that because about 1 month after he was sworn into his second term, and about 4 or 5 days after General Lee surrendered to General Grant, signaling the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln was gunned down by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer who had been planning on assassinating Lincoln for quite some time. So that was April 14th, 1865. Andrew Johnson becomes president, number 17. He is a Democrat. What was interesting was that Lincoln, to demonstrate his commitment to bringing the South and the North together, for his second term, he chose Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee, to be his vice president. Now, even though Johnson was a Southerner, he was against slavery, but it wasn't because he was for the rights of African Americans. He grew up as a poor Southerner, and he despised the rich white Southerners who owned plantations and who therefore owned slaves. So he didn't have a pure desire like the Northern Republicans, and especially the radical Republicans, to see the African Americans get their rights. His plan was very similar to Lincoln, and along with Confederate officials, he added, because remember, he did not like the Southern elites, the wealthy Southerners. He said they could not be a part of his plan. His plan would set up new state governments in each state, in which the North would appoint a governor for each state. The states would have to revise their state constitutions, and the voters in each state would elect their representatives. Also, the new states had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which, remember, freed all the slaves. By the end of 1865, everybody, 10 states except Texas, had created new governments. Johnson approved and said the United States has been restored. But many of the Northern Republicans complained that the new representatives coming from the South into the Congress were leaders of the Confederacy. And so Congress refused to admit or readmit Southern states into the Union. You need to be familiar with black codes. Remember, I told you that even though the Civil War ended, the Reconstruction period was really a second Civil War. The South resisted the North's attempts to introduce the slaves, the freed slaves, into Southern society. They didn't want the African Americans to be able to vote, to be able to own land, or to even be elected. So the Southern states enacted what has been called, and are called still, black codes. And these were just laws that limited, in the South, the freedom of African Americans. Really what it was a way to basically move from, okay, slavery was done away with, but we don't want equality between the African Americans and the whites. So let's make them serfs, basically, which was just a little bit above slaves. Serfs technically were not owned by masters, but they didn't have their own land. They had to work for others who had land. They had to sign a contract. The conditions of the contract were similar as those conditions under slavery. And even though African Americans were free, if they could not prove that they were employed, they could be arrested. African Americans could not own guns. They could not rent property except in big cities. So the Southern governments enacted these black codes to restrict the African American freedom. So this was going on. Johnson's plan was pretty lenient also. And so within the group of Republicans in the North, you had a group called the Radical Republicans. And they were called radical because they wanted to force the South to recognize the freedom of slaves, to allow them to start voting and even being elected. And they also wanted to, this was a major thing that made them, this was a major issue for why they were considered radical. They wanted to take the wealthy landowners of the South, take away their land, take away their plantations, and divide that land up and give plots of land to the freed slaves. Now, the ownership of land is a key American principle all the way back even before the Revolution. Now, of course, it was always at first it always applied to European Americans, European immigrants. And even though the Radical Republicans wanted to give this land to the freed African Americans, who not only were free, but the 14th Amendment had been passed, which guaranteed them all of the 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, they were to receive those benefits too. To divide up the land, even though they were wealthy plantation slave owners, that was not looked upon favorably. So that was their radical plan. There's the 14th Amendment. All people born or naturalized in the United States had equal protection of the laws, except for Native Americans. The states cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So Congress came up with their own plan called the Reconstruction Acts. And there were 3 of them. The first one, if you can, let me make this a little bigger. The first one, if you can see that little map there, that is the 11 states of the Confederacy, divided the South into 5 districts, which were oversaw by military commanders. So the 11 states, the radical Republicans said, we don't recognize the states and their governments under President Johnson's plan. We are going to divide them up into 5 districts and have our military commanders control those districts. And they're going to remain there until the South eventually comes back into the Union, and they will be readmitted when they write a new constitution for their state that supports the 14th Amendment and gives African American men the right to vote. The second act required that all adult males of the South, so this would be all the Confederates as well as all the commoners, all the men of the South had to swear loyalty to the United States. No longer could you be just loyal to the Confederacy. And then there was the third Reinforcement Act, Reconstruction Act. I'm sorry, there was not a third. I'm sorry. There were later reinforcement acts, but that's a different thing. Was there a question?
No.
All right. So who can tell me what is the big issue today, 2020? What is the big issue that if you were to go home today, turn on CNN or Fox News or NBC, what would be the big news item that you would hear about?
Impeachment.
Yeah.
Oh man, I should have took that slide off. Yeah. The impeachment of Donald Trump. Actually, he's already been impeached. The House impeached him. Now he's going before the Senate. And if the Senate votes to agree with the impeachment, he will be removed. If the Senate doesn't approve of what the House did, he will remain in office. A lot of Americans don't realize that if the House impeaches you, you're still the president. You have to then be removed by the Senate. So Donald Trump is the third president in our history to have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, the vice president of President Lincoln, who became president after Lincoln was killed, was the first president to be impeached. Does anyone know who the second president to be impeached was?
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, that's right.
Yes.
Clinton wasn't removed either. Now, there was a president who was about to be impeached, and he probably would have been removed, but he resigned instead. The only president to resign, that was
Lyndon Johnson.
Ronald Reagan.
No.
Ronald Reagan.
no Richard Nixon. So Johnson, the reason he almost got impeached was he fought against the radical Republicans and their efforts. And what Congress did was they said, we're going to pass a law to limit his power, and we think that he'll break that law. So they passed a law and basically said Johnson could not remove anyone from office. Well, Johnson defied that law, and he fired the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. The House of Representatives said, aha, here's our opportunity. And so they impeached him. They sent their impeachment articles to the Senate, Congress, or the Senate, sorry. I'll try not to confuse you, but Congress is one of the branches of government, and we have two houses in it. We have two chambers, sorry. The House of Representatives and the Senate. Impeachment always starts in the House, and if they vote to impeach, then it goes to the Senate. So they sent it to the Senate, but they did not get 2/3 of a vote to get rid of Johnson. They were one vote short. That's the closest we've ever been to impeachment. So he stayed in, but he was a good guy. He was a good boy. He promised to not fight Congress anymore. Congress then, actually, I'm sorry, Grant, General Grant, the great Union or Northern general, became president in 1868. President Johnson didn't even get the nomination from the Democrats because he had been impeached. And then Grant defeated, I think the guy's name was Seymour. During Grant's presidency, the 15th Amendment was passed, and that gave all African American men the right to vote. President Grant served 2 years, and he basically finished out the Reconstruction years. President Grant, even though he was a top-notch general in the Army, he was not a good politician. Or I should say, we're not talking about his character, talking about his effectiveness. He was not an effective politician. He basically laid down and let Congress kind of run over him. He was enthralled with wealthy men. And I guess he was given several houses during his time by these men, and other gifts, which we know means they're trying to bribe him. He often was clueless or blind to corruption that was going on around him. There's always been corrupt political leaders. It just is not in our time. And then several of the people in his cabinet turned out to be crooks, and they were engaged in criminal acts. One of the scandals was the Black Friday scandal, these two guys here, Fisk and Gould, they thought they would come up with a plan to make a lot of money off of gold. And their plan was working until President Grant and his honest leaders finally caught on to what was going on, and they were able to put a stop to the scheme. These two men were going to try to jack up the prices of gold and make a lot of money off of it. But Grant and his good leaders were able to stop it. And this caused many people to lose a lot of money. There was also a battle between northern bankers and southern farmers and laborers between whether we should have gold only in our currency, or should we keep this paper money that was printed during the Civil War called greenbacks. And they're called greenbacks because of the green dye. But during the Civil War, the U.S. Treasury had printed up a lot of money, a lot of paper money. And after the Civil War, wealthy bankers in the North wanted to go back to just the gold standard, wanted to get rid of all the paper money and just have coinage, gold, silver, and copper, with gold being the standard. Those in the South wanted to keep paper money because if they got rid of the paper money, it was going to cause the prices of all their crops to drop, and they would lose money. They would hit hard financially. Now remember, President Grant, he really was enthralled with wealthy businessmen, and he sided with these northern bankers, and he fought for just a gold standard. And when he did that, it caused the Panic of 1873, which you'll want to know about the Panic of 1873. It was a depression or a recession. And what happened was, because they were going to withdraw the greenbacks or the paper money, 25 railroad companies stopped paying their bills. And the leading business lender in the United States, a company called Jay Cooke and Company, went bankrupt on September 18th, 1873. And that triggered the Panic of 1873. About 3 million Americans lost their jobs. You would see a lot of, I think there's a picture in the textbook, you'll see a whole line of men leaning up against the building. It's a soup kitchen. It was just a really difficult time. So know the Panic of 1873. Now, if you will look on page 5, you don't have to look now, but you might want to mark this down. Page 559, this refers to what I mentioned earlier, the Enforcement Acts. And this is important because during the Reconstruction period, during the time of President Johnson and the beginning of President Grant, you had these groups in the South rise up. And these were radical groups that resisted Reconstruction, and they resented the Republicans from the North. And so these groups formed, and they had names like the White Knights of Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed in 1866. And these were terror groups. These were groups that intimidated with violence and threats and terrorism. And the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, had become pretty prominent. And so the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 71, this was Grant's and his government's attempts to stop these groups from their terror in the South. I want you to be familiar with those three acts, which are found on page 559. The last thing I want to mention for today's class is the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. Grant, he would have liked to have had a third term. At this time, there was no amendment that limited the presidency to just 2 terms, but Grant had proved to be an ineffective president, as we said, and so he did not seek a third term. And so in the election of 1876, Rutherford Hayes from Ohio was elected in, hold on just a second. You're gonna see my wonderful face again. Okay, I thought I had a slide about that election, but probably the closest election in our nation's history. A guy by the name of Tilden from New York was the Democratic nominee. He had 184 electoral votes. Back then, you needed 185. Hayes had 166 votes. There were 3 states which there were 19 electoral votes on the line. These 3 states had something fishy about their elections. And so 18 of those votes were given to Hayes, which made it 184 to 184 electoral votes. So whoever got that last vote would be president. Some of you might not realize that, and maybe with Trump's presidency, you learned that in your government class, but the president is not put into office by popular vote. A lot of times the popular vote is for the president or the person who wins, but sometimes the popular vote can be for the person who loses, like with Hillary Clinton. Hillary had more popular votes, but Trump won the Electoral College. This is what happened with Tilden and Hayes. Congress put together a special committee, and the committee voted 8-7 to give the final vote to Hayes. So Hayes won the Electoral College by 1 vote, but he had 3 million less, 300,000 less popular votes. But the reason this is important, and this is what basically shut down Reconstruction, was when they agreed to give Hayes the presidency. Tilden said, okay, but Hayes has to agree that after he becomes president, he pulls out all of the northern troops out of the South. Because remember, under Congress, under their Reconstruction, they had made those military districts. So after Hayes became president, he did what he promised. He took out all the troops from the South. And that effectively ended Reconstruction, because after that, all the Southern leaders were able to go back in and set up democratic governments and keep those black codes enforced. And there would still be another generation of abuse against African Americans in the South, even though it wasn't slavery. And that's why it's called the Compromise of 1877. We'll give the presidency to the Republican from the North, but he's got to take out all the troops from the South. And that effectively ended Reconstruction. So I will put these new slides up today. Do you have any questions? The last two slides basically talk about the impact of Reconstruction on the African Americans. All right, so the quiz will be available tomorrow at 10 p.m. It's only worth 15 points, so it's not very long. And again, it's open book at home or during class period. I prefer that you don't, if you work together, at least reword some of your answers so that you don't have exactly the same wording. That's pretty obvious. So you can work together, but try to put things in your own wording. And that'll be available for you to do Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, whatever's best for your schedule. If there's no questions, we will see you Monday at 1 o'clock. Have a great weekend.
See you, Teach.